I'd like you all to give Terry O'Gorman, the President of the Australian Council for Civil Liberties, a very warm welcome. We are here today to say to Campbell Newman and his Attorney General, no more of your extremism. No more of your extremist attacks on your judiciary. No more of your extremist attacks on criminal defence lawyers. The laws that he has passed are obscenely draconian. They're obscenely draconian. And, lest there be any doubt about it, I will cover in this speech references to Assistant Commissioner Brett Pointing and Tony Fitzgerald QC, both of whom make it quite clear that these laws can be applied to people other than Vikings. So for those who listen to the Premier's pronouncements on television, very much reminiscent of the Joe, don't you worry about that, it's only about Vikings, well, let me make it quite clear to you. Assistant Commissioner Brett Pointing, who's in charge of these laws, made it clear in a background briefing interview on the ABC a week ago that these laws apply to everyone. You, me, our families and our friends. So don't be caught that it's just about Vikings, because from the horse's mouth it does not apply to just Vikings. And how absurd is it? How absurd is it that Vikings cannot be present at this political gathering? Those very people who are subject to this obscenely draconian legislation, if more than 3 of them are here at this protest rally, they get arrested and serve a minimum 6 months in jail. How obscenely draconian and extreme that is.
You can't even go to court to defend themselves.
Quite so. Now, to understand the present, you've got to understand the past. When the Liberal National Party were last in power, 70s and 80s, and they were again in power for 2 years, 1996 to 1998, forget about that period. When the Liberal National Party were last in power in the 70s and 80s, they had the same thumping majority that they've got now, and they used that same thumping majority in an authoritarian manner in the same way we're seeing Newman and Blade use it now. Remember in 1971, many of you looking around clearly were not around, but at that time, in the early stages of the Bjelke-Petersen era, a state of emergency was declared to allow the South African Springboks, who would only allow whites to play, a state of emergency to allow that racially selected team to play at the exhibition ground where police were busting from all over the state. In 1977, we had the previous LNP government ban street march laws. And I remember being in this square on a Saturday afternoon in October 1977, seeing so-called ordinary people march around the block and get arrested because they weren't permitted to march. 400 people arrested in one afternoon. Then we had the Fitzgerald inquiry. The Fitzgerald inquiry revealed police corruption, serious political maladministration and corruption, and he put in place a template and a blueprint to attempt to ensure that this has not or will not happen again, and up till now, that has worked. Up until now. In 1996, when the National Liberals were last in power, for a short period of time, they did their best to shut down the Crime Misconduct Commission, which was the independent body that Fitzgerald set up to try to deal with police corruption and political maladministration. Let's move to the present. Let's look briefly at how these land laws came about. On a Thursday night in late September last year, the head of the dog squad on the Gold Coast was shot during the course of an armed robbery. Nothing to do with biking. The police union were on the warpath. This was the second shooting of a police officer in over 18 months. They were on the warpath and they said to this government, we told you we needed more police. The government saw a huge problem coming. 24 hours later, the banditos handed this government an hour. The banditos had their fight in a public place, and that was seized upon by this government to bring in these anti-democratic, these obscenely draconian laws. But let me put one bit of the propaganda and spin to bed. Part of the justification for these laws were two things. After the banditos fight, an anonymous bikie, if he or she ever existed, was quoted as saying, you live here, we run the place. And that anonymous quote, if it was ever made, was seized upon by the government to bring in these laws. The government also claimed that immediately after the rule, the Southport police station was, quote, laid siege to, end quote. I can tell you I have taken statements from a number of people who were present outside the Southport Watch House, including some non-bikies, and there was no laying siege to the police station at all. That was simply propaganda. It is simply lies issued by the police that have been repeated over and over and over again, so it is now accepted as fact. It is fundamentally false. Fundamentally false. And we don't need to be students of history to see how a lie that is turned into spin, that is turned into propaganda, is then used by demagogues. That did not happen. There is currently a complaint for a person that I represent, a non-bikie, who was present when 5 or 6 police cars turned up, started using force against the people who were there. The police were the ones who instigated the event outside the police station. The bikies were simply there waiting for their arrested friends to be released. Let's move to the van laws. Quite so. The major parts of the van laws are that if you are arrested for something as little as possession of drugs, and it can be established that you're a participant or an associate, friend, someone who simply from time to time spends time with a bikie, you will get a fine for possession of the drugs. But if you are a member of one of the 26 bikie clubs that are declared criminal organisations, you must serve 15 years on top of that fine. 15 years. This Premier, this boy Attorney General, this ex-conveyancer who is now making our laws, tells the judges, and they have absolutely no power to mitigate this, says to the judge, yeah, you're going to fine that bikie for being in possession of drugs, but because he's a bikie, you must send him to jail for a minimum of 15 years. How obscene and how draconian is that? But it gets worse. If you're an office bearer, add 10 years. So if you're a president, secretary, sergeant-at-arms of any of these 26 declared criminal organisations, your fine becomes a fine plus a mandatory minimum 25 years.
The file gets less.
Here it is that the Attorney General and the Premier are telling the judges, irrespective of the injustice that this will cause, irrespective of the obscenity of such a long sentence, you must, because we're telling you so, you must impose a sentence of 25 years on top of a fine. That's so. And as well, we have the scourge of solitary confinement. Anyone who goes to jail or who was in jail when these laws come in are now subject to a solitary confinement regime. You don't need to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist to know the destruction that solitary confinement causes to people's mental health and that causes to their physical health. A senior judge of the Supreme Court in late December called for submissions in respect of a bikie who is to go to jail, and that judge reviewed all of the literature dealing with solitary confinement, particularly in the US and elsewhere, and concluded that it was seriously harmful to mental health. For his observations, he was one of the judges who's been constantly abused, ridiculed and undermined by our Premier and by the Attorney General. But it gets worse. If you work in the construction industry, if you're an electrician, say, now you can have your ticket taken away from you, you can't work, you can't be employed, and you can't see the evidence on which your ticket is taken away. So under this new law, we have a new regime of secret evidence. The police can simply get a dossier together on anyone in this crowd who's an electrician and say, you may not be a bikie, but you're an associate of a bikie, therefore we take away your ticket, we take away your ability to do your job, and we will not show you the evidence. That, again, is obscenely draconian and extreme. I want to read what the Attorney General said in 2009 when the first lot of bikie laws that were brought in by Labor. He said, and listen to this and watch the words and mark this man's rank, unmitigated, base hypocrisy. This is what he said in Parliament in 2009. This bill is an attack on the right of freedom of association. While it is currently intended for motorcycle gangs, once again, this bill does not mention the term bikie or motorcycle gangs, and this piece of legislation could be used against any group that may fall into disfavour regardless of the purpose of the gathering. This is the Attorney General and what he said in 2009. The very criticisms that are now being levelled against him in relation to this current set of bikie laws Mark II that are extreme by a factor of 10 compared to the Criminal Organisation Act that he was railing against at that time. And what he went on to say, and listen to the man's hypocrisy a bit more, what he went on to say is, while I agree that people need to be protected from organised crime, there must also be the protection of personal liberties, such as the freedom of association. This is what he said in 2009. Go to Hansard, it's there. He said that while I agree that people need to be protected from organised crime, there must also be the protection of personal liberties such as the freedom of association. Tell that to the Andina 5. Tell that to the librarian who was at a country hotel and who spent days in jail trying to get bail. Freedom of association in this state, if you have the slightest connection with the bikie, is dead and buried. I want to finish by reading extracts from an article written last week by Tony Fitzgerald QC. I want to read this because of the brief trawl back into history that I've done. It was Tony Fitzgerald's blueprint that at least over the last 20 plus years has kept this state from falling back into the bad old ways of the Bjelke-Petersen era. This week, maybe even tonight, this boy Attorney General, this person who rails against restrictions on freedom of association in 2009 and then brings in the worst possible laws in relation to freedom of association in 2013, is going to introduce a bill this week that, in the words of Fitzgerald QC, will turn the CMC from a watchdog into a lapdog. This is what Fitzgerald said. Politicians who cynically misuse the power of the state for personal or political benefit are a far greater threat to democracy than criminals. Politicians who cynically use the power of the state, read for that Newman and Blay, for personal or political benefit. They're down in the polls, they know they have problems, are a far greater threat to democracy than criminals. This is not Jerry O'Gorman saying this. This is not a bikie saying this. This is not a criminal defence lawyer saying this. This is not the Supreme Court judge that this government loves to undermine, but it's the architect of the reform of the 70s and 80s who has said that. He also made this point in the article. Two of the objections that are raised to the bikie legislation are that it restricts the power of courts to grant bail to bikies who are charged with those refused bail, remanded in custody until they are tried and perhaps acquitted, and requires courts to impose grossly disproportionate sentences in some circumstances, an additional 25 years imprisonment on bikies who are convicted. Now I read Fitzgerald on that point because those of us who want to say, well, you'd expect the Civil Liberties Council to exaggerate about 25 years. You'd expect O'Gorman to exaggerate. This is Fitzgerald who is saying this. This is the person who exposed the political maladministration, the political corruption, the police verbally of the 70s and 80s, the police fabrication of evidence in the 70s and 80s. He went on to say, worse, bikies remanded in custody pending trial who might be acquitted, and bikies who've been convicted and sentenced to long terms of imprisonment can be routinely locked in their cells in solitary confinement for 22 hours a day based on untested information supplied by police to corrective services. And that's what happened. And again, this is Fitzgerald saying this. They can be routinely locked in their cells in solitary confinement for 22 hours a day based on untested, and I stress, untested police information. This is an absolute bloody disgrace. I've been asked to finish, so I will finish with the closing words of Fitzgerald's article. Fitzgerald finished his article last week reminding us of the necessity to not forget history. He said, in a well-known poem, Martin Niemöller, a German Lutheran pastor and theologian who the Nazis imprisoned in concentration camps from 1937 to 1945, succinctly summarised the bleakness of popular complacency in the face of injustice to others. And Fitzgerald went on to say, Pastor Niemöller reminds us that in the face of oppression, remember this. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Premier Newman and Attorney General Bay, we are sick of your extremism. We are sick of your attacks on judges. We are sick of your obscenely draconian Mikey legislation.